Here's how to set up your first project document. You'll need to download the Basic Shapes JPEG. If we go into Photoshop, you can make a new document by going to File and down to New, and this will bring up our New Document dialog box. Now there's a couple of things to know about setting up these documents. First of all, I'm going to start measuring everything in pixels rather than inches, millimeters, or even points. The reason why you want to measure your digital illustration in pixels is because Photoshop is a pixel formatted environment. All the documents you make are made up of pixels. Additionally, we're not going to really be printing these off, so it doesn't matter what the final size is. As long as it has enough pixels, it'll be a great resolution for your screen. Second, everything in Photoshop is measured in pixels. Things like your brushes, line weights, even some layer styles are measured off in pixels. If you grab a brush that's 500 pixels wide and your document is 1,000 pixels wide, then you know it's a pretty good size brush. It's going to take up half of your document. So everything can be related relative to the size of your document. The final reason is because when you measure things in pixels, it becomes resolution independent. It doesn't matter what resolution it is, whether it's 70 pixels or even 700, it's the same number of pixels for your whole document. Vector documents are also resolution independent. So when we start creating things in Illustrator and copying and pasting them over into Photoshop, things will paste very nicely. The second thing to consider is the color mode we're working in. In general, we'll always work in RGB color mode. This is because RGB will give us the widest range of colors, and our blending modes tend to work out a lot better than working in CMYK. For the background, in this one we're going to keep it white. We'll say OK, and this is what our document looks like. The first thing I need to do is to set my background layer to be a nice middle shade of gray. Whenever you do a drawing or a painting, it's a good habit to get into a mid-tone than working on a white sheet of paper or even a dark sheet of paper. So to do this, I'm going to hit Shift and Delete. This will bring up my Fill dialog box, and we're going to fill it with 50% gray. When I say OK, now my background layer is 50% gray. From here, I can take my Shapes JPEG, click and drag it into my document, and you can see it fills up the entire area. Since I drug it into here, I need to hit the checkbox at the very top, and this will lock in the size that it has. Let me pull up my layers so we can see what we're working with. Also, I'm going to hit the F key, and that'll take us into full screen mode and block out whatever's in the background. You can see because I drug the JPEG into my document, the little icon at the bottom right indicates that this is a smart object. Smart objects are a little bit more difficult to work with. I need to get rid of the blue area, and I can't do that with my eraser tool. If I try to click and drag with the eraser, it's only going to say that the smart object needs to be rasterized, so we're going to say OK to that. Instead of erasing it away, we're going to create a layer mask. Layer mask works like erasing, but it gives me the ability to undo the area that I've erased away. So if I made a mistake, I can undo it. To do this, let's go over and select our Magic Wand tool. With the Magic Wand tool selected, we'll need to set our tool options to have a tolerance of 20, check off Continuous, and also check off Sample All Layers. Now, whenever I click on the blue area, this will select the blue, and I can go up to Layer, down to Layer Mask, and choose Hide Selection. I want to hide the blue that we selected. Now we see the gray background that's behind it. And check out our layers. I've got the layer mask, and you can see wherever it's black, that's where it's masked off. Now we can continue actually making the painting. Here's how I want you to start thinking about making your paintings. Everything needs to have its own layer. Right now I've got a background layer that has a background color. I've got a layer that has all of my shapes. So when I start adding colors and shadows and highlights, they need their own layer too. The reason why we do this is if I make a mistake, I can go back and erase away all my colors and highlights without ever losing my shapes layer. Additionally, I can go back and erase and not have to worry about losing my background layer. This is the essence of working in digital. You can't do this with a regular painting media. You can't do this with drawing. Only in Photoshop, only in digital media can you work in this layered style. So I've made layer 1. I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool and let's talk a little about some of the options you can work with. If I go up to my options, I've got a couple of buttons to deal with. We know about opacity, but what about these two off to the side? This first little button, if I click it, allows me to control the pressure sensitivity that controls the opacity of my brush. This means if I was to click and hold lightly with my pen tool, I get a very light opacity, but as I start to press harder, you can see I get a much, much darker opacity. And this is great for easily building up different layers and different levels of a color. The second tool, if I uncheck that one, this one right here, allows me to control the pressure sensitivity of the size of my brush. So with this one, if I press and hold lightly, I get a very small tool, and as I press harder, it gets much bigger. And the size of the final brush is dependent on the size of the brush I have selected. So if I have a much smaller brush, I can press lightly and it only gets a little bit big. You'll learn to work between both of these depending on what situation you need. If you're having to work between larger and smaller areas, I would suggest using the pressure sensitivity for size. If you're having to try to shade something or work between lights and darks really quickly, then you can turn on your opacity changing. It's rare for me to have to use both of those. And actually for this one, I'm going to keep both of them off. Instead, I'm going to keep the same size brush and just use my keyboard shortcuts to control the opacity, the size, and the hardness of my brush. Here's the next thing we want to set up for our document. Whenever we do a painting, we want to have nice clean edges and stay inside of the object's area that we're painting in. So to do this, we're going to turn on a clipping mask. Notice how when I paint over the circle, the area that's outside of it, well, I really don't want that. I wanted everything to stay inside of the circle. So if we look at our layers, layer 1 is on top of the basic shapes. To create a new clipping mask, we can go up to Layer and down to Create Clipping Mask. Remember the keyboard shortcut is Option-Command-G. Whenever I turn on a clipping mask, this is what I get. Anything that's inside of layer 1 will be masked to the shape that's in the basic layer shape. In this case, it's staying inside of the circle that I painted on top of. And this is great for doing any type of painting. So all I've got to do now, I'm going to delete everything away, is to select my brush. I can then change the size of it, maybe get a little bit softer edge. And when I change the opacity, all of my painting stays nice and inside of that particular area. All I have to worry about is the colors that I'm working in, and I don't have to worry about going over the edges. However, if I do make my brush a little bit too big, you can see in this case it's going to be inside of the circle and it's going to start getting inside of another area. Well, I don't want it to bleed over to that. So we're going to do one more thing. I'm going to delete this away. I'm going to choose my marquee tool. In this case, I can either use the rectangle or the elliptical tool. And I'm going to highlight or select the shape that I want to work in. In this case, I'm going to select the circle. Whenever I select my paintbrush tool, wherever I paint, it'll only stay inside of that marquee area. This means if I go outside of it, it's going to be masked off. Nothing's going to go outside of that selected area. You can see this if I take away the clipping mask. This is what it looks like. See how everything stays inside of the marquee? If I turn back on the clipping mask, it'll look all nice and pretty. By the way, you can hide your selected area by going up to View and down to Extras. Command H for Hide will turn it off. It's still selected, but it's just not visible at this time. You can always go back and show it again by hitting Command H, going up to your extras from there. So this is the basics of how we're going to work. In the next video, you'll see me how I work through and do the actual shading for each individual objects, and you can apply these techniques to your creation.